Hi, seventh graders, and welcome back to Washington State History. We are going to be reading Chapter 8, Lesson 2. And so if you're going to follow along with me, we're on page 196, and we're going to go all the way to, let me see here, page 202. Okay, so just read along with me if you like. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Let me see if I can get that right here. We're at the Civil Rights Movement, Lesson 2. Okay. Second-class citizens. African Americans fought heroically in both wars. They helped to free Europe from the control of oppressive or unjustly harsh governments and dictators. However, back in the United States, Black Americans were still second-class citizens. The U.S. Constitution guaranteed Black Americans the same rights as whites, but those rights were largely ignored. In many states, Blacks could not vote or run for office. They were not allowed to serve on a jury or testify in court against a white person. In many southern states, Jim Crow laws separated the races. Jim Crow was a name given to laws that made segregation, or the separation of races, legal. Jim Crow laws applied to most public places. For example, public schools were segregated. Black children could not attend the same schools as white children. Blacks were required to sit in the back of movie theaters and buses, and public parks had separate drinking fountains. In Washington, like in most other states, Blacks experienced discrimination and segregation. They were not welcome in most restaurants or hotels, and they could not use public swimming pools. Housing discrimination. Blacks could buy houses only in certain sections of cities, including Seattle and Spokane. At the Bremerton Navy Base, as well as the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, Blacks and whites worked together but lived in separate areas. A Spokane Valley Real Estate Code of Ethics said, "A realtor should never introduce into a neighborhood any race whose presence will lower property values in that neighborhood." Guidelines for an Ephrata neighborhood said, "No persons other than those of the Caucasian race shall ever occupy any building in this subdivision, except domestic servants, employed and living in the building, occupied by said owner." Okay, so now let's look at the picture right down here at the bottom. Whoops, let me go like this. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and then we're going to be at the top of this next page. Challenging inequality. In the 1950s, a movement in the Black community began. Blacks began to challenge the inequity they faced. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. from Atlanta, Georgia, emerged as the leader of the civil rights movement. He led peaceful protest marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. King and his wife, Coretta, visited Seattle to help efforts in Washington. The first major victory of the civil rights movement was a Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. This important ruling declared that segregation in public schools was illegal. Other victories soon followed. Reverend King and his followers challenged segregation of buses during the Montgomery bus boycott. A boycott is a form of protest where people refuse to buy or use the products or services of an organization whose practices they dislike. For more than a year, Blacks refused to ride the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Their actions resulted in another Supreme Court ruling that banned segregation on public buses. Okay, so here's the caption. I'm going to read that caption, and then I'm also going to read this sidebar right here. So the caption, Black and white citizens marched together in 1965 protests in Seattle. What are they protesting? Okay, so now for the sidebar. Civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a non-violent form of protest. It involves peacefully breaking a law to make a point. Martin Luther King Jr. believed that civil disobedience was the best way to challenge unjust laws. Sit-ins and boycotts are examples of the type of civil disobedience that King and his followers practice. Seattle experienced its first sit-in in July 1963, when civil rights activists occupied the mayor's office for 24 hours. The group was protesting housing discrimination. The protest was peaceful, and the protesters left the next morning. Later that month, however, a group of protesters was arrested after boycotting city council chambers for 4 days. After a councilman tipped and fell over one of the protesters, they were ordered to leave. When they refused, police officers took them to jail. And the caption states, police arrest a group of teens and young adults participating in a sit-in in Seattle's municipal building. What makes this a non-violent protest? And then the what do you think question. Why do you think nonviolent protests were effective than violent protests? Why were they more effective? What do you think? Okay, we're turning the page. We're on page 198. Civil rights victories. It took a long time, but civil rights activists finally scored several major victories in the 1960s. For example, the U.S. Congress passed the following laws. In 1964, Civil Rights Act prohibiting any kind of discrimination in public places. In 1965, Voting Rights Act that eliminated literacy tests for Black voters. And the 1968 Fair Housing Act that prohibited discrimination in the sale of rental properties. Okay, so I'm going to read this sidebar right here, and then I'm also going to read this sidebar right here for some cool facts. Okay. The turbulent 60s. Unrest over civil rights and the war in Vietnam erupted in a wave of violence in the 1960s. Among those assassinated were President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, an outspoken African American leader who did not always agree with King's methods, Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, who was a civil rights advocate and presidential candidate. In Washington, Edwin Pratt, the director of Seattle Urban League, a civil rights group, was also killed. Okay, now this little section that says Washington Portrait. Karl Maxey, 1924 to 1927. Karl Maxey was the first Black attorney in Spokane. He worked hard to end discrimination and segregation in the city since he had experienced both as a young man. Before becoming a lawyer, Maxey served in the U.S. Army. He wanted to become an Army pilot, but Blacks were barred from joining the Air Corps at that time. When he became the city's first Black lawyer, Spokane still had no Black doctors, dentists, or teachers. He wanted to change that. When the Spokane School District refused to hire an extremely qualified Black teacher, Maxey came to his aid. He successfully persuaded the district to change its policy. By 1969, there were 20 Black teachers in the Spokane School District. Maxey also challenged a local barbershop when it refused to serve a Black student from the African community of country of Liberia. Maxey took up the cause after a group of Black and white students picketed the barbershop. They carried signs that read, "Prejudice prevents progress. Help Spokane grow." Their protest was shown on national television. The barber was ordered to change his policy as a result of Maxey's persuasive argument to the state's Board of Discrimination. Okay, we're on page 199. The movement spreads. The civil rights movement was an inspiration to other minority groups in the United States. The term minority refers to a group that differs in race, religion, gender, or ethnic background from the dominant group. A minority group sometimes has little power or representation compared to the dominant group. Mexican Americans and Native Americans both adopted methods similar to Black activists and fought discrimination. Women, although not considered a minority in number, also joined in the fight for rights. All three groups had some notable successes. Uniting farm workers. As you read in Chapter 7, many Mexicans, also called Chicanos, came to the United States as part of the Bracero program. They came to Washington to harvest crops. Many stayed and settled in the central part of the state. By the 1970s, migrants were coming each year to harvest crops. Many of them settled here permanently. In Othello and other farming towns, Mexican Americans soon made up more than half of the population. Although they came to the United States to escape poverty in Mexico, the situation here was not much better. Working conditions on the farms were terrible and the pay was very low. By the late 1960s, almost 40% of the Mexican farm workers in Yakima County lived in poverty. Organizing a labor union was difficult as migrant farm workers moved around a lot. Probably the most well-known Mexican American civil rights leader was Cesar Chavez. Like Martin Luther King, Chavez believed in nonviolent protest. He founded the United Farm Workers Union and organized a nationwide boycott of California grapes. To show support for striking grape pickers, University of Washington students convinced school officials to stop selling grapes in campus cafeterias. It was the first campus in the United States to do so. Before the 1970s, Mexican American citizens in Washington had to prove they could read English before they were allowed to vote. A civil rights group successfully challenged the restrictions in court and won. Okay, so I'm going to read these two. There's this one right here. And then I'm going to read, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Read this picture and then this picture. Okay, so the picture of the man is Hispanic activist Cesar Chavez, founded the United Farm Workers Union. He brought attention to the hardships of migrant farm workers. Okay, and then the picture right below. Migrant workers take a break in their barracks. How would you describe their living conditions? Take a look at that picture. See what you think about their living conditions. Okay, we're on to page 200. Native American movement. The struggle for rights in the Native American community was different from the struggle of Blacks and Latinos. Native Americans were not seeking to be fully absorbed in American society. Instead, they wanted to protect the rights promised to them in treaties. Most important was the protection of tribal sovereignty and fishing rights. Additionally, Indian activists looked to improve conditions on reservations. An activist is a person who strongly supports a cause. After World War II, the government's Indian policies changed again. The goal of the new policies was to move Indians off reservations and into cities, where they might find better job opportunities. Jobs on the reservation were very limited, but Indians found that life in the city was not easy. They faced discrimination. Good jobs and decent housing were hard to find. To raise awareness and get some help, Native Americans took over Fort Lawton in 1970. Bernie Whitebear, a member of the Colville Federated Tribe, organized the protest. After nearly 2 years of negotiations, the government agreed to create the Daybreak Star Center, a Native American cultural center on the grounds of the fort. Fishing rights. One of the most important court decisions in Washington's history was handed down in Tacoma by federal judge George Bolt in 1974. U.S. versus Washington, or the Bolt decision, has had an enormous impact on Native Americans' rights, salmon management, and state politics. Judge Bolt ruled that fishing restrictions placed on Indians violated the treaties signed in the 1850s. The ruling restored off-reservation fishing sites to Native Americans. It gave them the right to harvest steelhead as well as salmon for food. Non-Indian fishermen were outraged by the decision. Bumper stickers appeared with, "Can Judge Bolt, not salmon." One of the biggest issues facing Native Americans today is the decreasing fish population. We will read more about this in the next lesson. However, it is important to note here that nearly a third of the scientists working on salmon issues are Native Americans. Even the smallest tribes have their own scientists and lawyers, and many of them are Native Americans. It is common for half of the tribe's employees to work in natural resources. Okay, so we're going to look at this picture. Whoops. Right here, and I'm going to read, wrong way. I'm going to read this caption. Bernie Whitebear organized the protest at Fort Lawton in 1970. One of the signs reads, "Red Power." What is the main message of the protest? Okay, we're on page 201. Women's rights. In the 1970s, another group worked for equal rights. Although women represent about half of the U.S. population and half of Washington's population, they did not enjoy the same rights and advantages as white men. In most jobs, women were paid less than men. There was a great separation of men's and women's jobs. Men were doctors and women were nurses. Men were business owners and women were secretaries. School principals were nearly always men. School sports teams were open only to boys. Women had a hard time getting loans or credit cards in their own names. The national movement for women's rights was called feminism, or women's liberation. The goal of the feminist movement was to gain equal rights, including equal opportunity. Across the nation, people worked to add an Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, to the U.S. Constitution. It would guarantee that neither men nor women would be denied any right on the basis of gender. Although Congress passed ERA, it failed to get approval from enough states to make it a law. A multicultural Washington. During the last 30 years, minority citizens and women in Washington have become more involved in government. Today, Washington is a very multicultural state. Washington's many ethnic groups make this state a dynamic place to live. Asian Americans. Before World War II, many Japanese American families farmed in rural areas outside Seattle, Tacoma, and other cities. They grew fruits and vegetables and sold them to city dwellers. After the war, the Japanese left the relocation camps and returned to their homes. Many found difficult conditions. They had been gone 3 years and much had changed. Often their property had been vandalized and strangers were living in their homes. Some Asian Americans entered politics. Wing Luke was elected to Seattle City Council in 1963, the son of the first Chinese American elected to any office in the state. Luke died in a plane crash a few years later. Okay, here's our pictures. I'm going to read the caption on this one, and then I'm going to read this little section about ERA. Wing Luke and his mother visiting an Asian market in Seattle in 1962. Luke was the first Asian American to be elected to public office. Although the ERA was never added to the U.S. Constitution, Washington added a similar amendment to its Constitution in 1973. And now here at the bottom is a fun fact. Gary Locke became the nation's first Asian American governor when Washington voters elected him in 1996. Okay, on to page 202. Who are we today? There is a wide diversity of people in Washington today. Immigration, especially from Latin America and Asia, continues to grow. Latinos are the state's largest minority. Immigration of Asian and Pacific Islanders increased 60% since the last census. The number of Native Americans increased 20%. Cultural diversity has many faces. People cannot be grouped by a census report alone. In today's world, many people have a mixed racial heritage. When I was younger, it was annoying when people would just assume I was Mexican, said Efren Olivares. I'm from Venezuela, but I just let it go. My wife is from Guatemala. Our neighbors are from Puerto Rico. On the census, we are all Hispanic. People make similar assumptions about Asians, the majority of which are Chinese, said Moon Ji. But there are Japanese, Vietnamese, Koreans, Filipino, Asian Indians, and others. I wish people would be more culturally sensitive. We are not all alike. We like to explain our culture to people if they would ask. Oops, I'm going to go over here. Okay, so I'm going to read this. And then, I'm going to read this little chart right here too. Washington's population is becoming more diverse as immigrants from Latin America and Asia continue to move here. So this little chart has population facts from 2006. So this is the U.S. Census data from 2006. Now it's interesting because right now everybody is doing the census for 2020. So I'm just going to say the estimated population in Washington is 6,395,798, as compared to the U.S., which is 299,398,484. Those are big numbers for Mrs. Larson. Ugh. Women make up about 50%. White make up about 84%. This is all Washington. Black persons make up about almost 4%, about 3.6. American Indians and Alaska Natives make up 1.6. Asian make up 6.6. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, 0.5%. Persons of Latino origin, 9.1%. Okay, that is it for this lesson. Have a great day. Whoops. Okay, now I